You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 434, the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Merry Christmas, everyone. And, thanks for being with me for another year. As we wrap up 2019, I do hope to do a couple shows in the next week on how certain wars and crises or, diplomatic things getting better have progressed in 2019. And then maybe do a show kind of looking at what we could expect in 2020. But for now, I got a lot of news to cover on today's show. While a lot of us are celebrating Christmas, a couple days off of work, and generally in this cultural spirit or vibe of goodwill towards others and stuff like that, that certainly isn't reflected in Americans' foreign policy, which is cranked up and killing people as much as ever. So, talking about a lot of that on today's show. Share the show, find it online at the Libertarian Institute. While you're at the Libertarian Institute, check out the daily news roundup that's featured on the homepage. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it on one of the podcast feeds. And if you really like the show, think about donating. It's Christmas. Some people are in the giving spirit. So if you thought maybe for a little bit about donating to the show, now maybe is the time to pull the trigger. Right now, you donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So I think probably most of my audience is aware of the story of Christmas in 1914, where World War I is raging in Europe. It's a lot longer and worse than anyone thought it would be. And on Christmas Day that year, and I think in the days leading up to it, at several places along the front, you have people leave the trenches, go out into no man's zone, and kind of have a Christmas truce and exchange. They talked about exchanging cigarettes with each other, in some cases singing songs, sharing cultural stuff, playing soccer. And it's a really, interesting phenomenon that's happened in, this was repeated, I believe it was in 2018. There was a ceasefire over an Islamic holiday in Afghanistan. You had Taliban fighters enter cities for the first time, in over a decade, and, visiting different sites and seeing different people they haven't seen all this time. And then a few days later, they're back to fighting in war and trying to kill each other. When it's like if you go up there, shake hands and exchange cigarettes with somebody, then why the hell are you trying to kill that guy? And, it would just be great if somebody would actually make that wake up call. But these, kind of Christmas ceasefires are always interesting. There's a couple good articles today at antiwar.com. Will Gregg has a great, and this is the late Will Gregg, so it's from a couple of years ago, I believe at FFF. Will Gregg wrote this great piece describing what happened and why it should happen again at the Christmas truce. And then there's another one by Danny Surgeon, Major Danny Surgeon, that I really like, and he focuses a little bit less on the history than Will Gregg does, but more on the lesson that we need to take from the Christmas truce. Well, we certainly need to listen to that lesson. That's not what's happening this year, and with that, I guess kind of a dark irony, get into some of the news. Well, actually, you know what? I didn't even realize it, but I have somewhat of a light story to start off here. Senator Rand Paul put out his Festivus grievances, as he does every year. And this is, kind of one of his more libertarian yearly traditions, where he finds all this kind of misspending and terrible positions of the Trump administration, or, whatever administration is in place at the time, and airs his grievances. I don't know if anybody watched Seinfeld. Fred Costanza, George's dad, Frank Costanza, celebrates Festivus, and so Rand Paul kind of takes out of that tradition. This year, you had some bashing of John Bolton and Rudy Giuliani in it. He tweets to his father's ultimate takedown of Rudy Giuliani in the 2007 campaign that made so many of us, either libertarians or stronger libertarians. I mean, it's really what helped me to understand this whole foreign policy thing. was Ron Paul's exchange with Rudy Giuliani there, even though I didn't see it live. It was a couple of years later I finally caught on to that. But that's really important. And so along with, talking about spending $700,000 trying to determine the effects of nicotine on fish, or $22 million subsidizing Serbian cheese, there's a lot of other real substance stuff in Rand Paul's airing of the grievances. So a little bit of a lighter tape, but at the same time talking about some of the problems of the government. Check out that linked in the show notes page. Trump signed the 2020 NDAA. I've been talking about this on the show in the past couple weeks, wrote an article on at the Libertarian Institute. $738 billion going to the Pentagon Department of Energy and the Warfighting Fund / Fund for the Pentagon this year. Absolutely a terrible bill for our pocketbooks, but also it unties the hands of the executive even more when it comes to war, and does some things that don't even seem to really have anything to do with the Pentagon, like giving 12 weeks of paid family leave to every federal employee. So that's all in the bill that is now law. There is a couple stories out on particularly one thing that is now law, and that is sanctioning of Russian energy projects. And so this would place sanctions on the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's going to bring liquefied natural gas from Russia to Germany and then to the rest of the Europe at obviously cheaper prices than the U.S. could bring it overseas on cargo ships. Now, the statement that Angela Merkel made, that's the German leader, said that she thought the pipeline could be completed within the 30-day cooldown period, which I understand to mean that for 30 days, the construction projects that are probably ongoing are going to be allowed to keep going, because a pipeline may be the kind of like complicated project where, you maybe had to do things for the next 20 days or so to make sure that the things that are being built are at least there safely. And everything like that. So you give like this cool down period on the construction project, and Merkel says that the pipeline may be done in that time, so no need to worry about the U.S. sanctions. Russia said they're not going to follow the sanctions, and while Germany says they won't retaliate, which I would guess means putting some kind of sanctions on the U.S., Russia says that they will. Russia also says they believe they could complete the Turk Stream pipeline, which will also bring Russian energy now I guess into more southern Europe via Turkey, even though the sanctions will be in place. I don't know if anybody else has had the chance to read Edward Snowden's biography that he wrote, Permanent Record, but I actually like it quite a bit. He's a good enough writer that makes it flow well, and the guy's had a pretty interesting life, so I would check it out if you haven't, although I'm not sure if you want to buy the book because a judge ruled that the government can now seize all the profits of Snowden's book. So, that's kind of disappointing because I don't want the government to have any more of my money. And Snowden certainly deserves it for, his integrity and, very important statement by leaking all those documents to Glenn Greenwald in the Washington Post to explain to us how much our government was spying on us. The judge's ruling, I guess, comes as Snowden violated technically, whatever kind of agreement he had with the CIA or contracting companies he was working with, that he would submit to them any record or story of him being on the job before it becomes published. Obviously, Snowden didn't do this because he's a wanted man and he lives in Russia and everything. So you really wouldn't think he would have to. Any contract he had with these organizations has obviously been broken long since. And they were violating the Constitution. And so this seems to be, just more U.S. government, this time the judicial branch, siding with kind of the deep state actors in the CIA intelligence community. This is disturbing. I'm seeing this more and more, which is U.S. law enforcement utilizing either social media or companies who do kind of work on data collected from social media companies. And this time it is immigration enforcement. I thought this was important enough to talk about just because to make people aware that this is happening, where immigration enforcement is contracting with this other company and people are going around looking for people who should no longer be in the country, posting things on Facebook. This one guy that's highlighted in the Intercept story was caught because, he was using his real name and checking in at places on Facebook. So, in one sense, it may seem like, if you don't do something stupid like this, he deserved to get caught. Obviously, the guy's trying to be with his family and work a job. He shouldn't be thrown out of the country. But it is something to be aware of that, these are the new police state tactics. And I'm sure it's not just going to be limited to immigration. It's going to span more and more to other kind of crimes and areas. All right, so there's going to be a lot of thinking of the troops on Christmas. I'm seeing ads in my Twitter feed already about how they're setting up all the TVs overseas for the troops to watch the different games, college football bowl games, stuff like that. We're talking about fundraising money for calls, between the 200,000, I think they say, Department of Defense employees who will not spend Christmas with their families. And, they stand like all these people are doing such an important job and they're such important people. This is why our foreign policy is unquestionable. And, it's them and their brave service that is keeping us safe. Well, one of the ways we could see that's not true is the way the U.S. government treats our veterans. They're now saying that at least 61 soldiers who were stationed at a base in Uzbekistan known as K2 have contracted cancer since 2001. Many of these people are young men, people suffering from brain cancers and all kinds of horrible diseases. And because the VA does not label this base as one that, causes a precondition of cancer, many of the people are having to pay for these treatments out of pocket. So it's absolutely sickening what how they cast away the troops. And, even the story at the time says, there was radiation and chemical weapons fields around this base and they put up dirt barriers. And, all the troops are standing there saying like, what does a dirt barrier do to radiation? They talk about how every time it rained, the ground turned into this like sticky, gross mud. And that's likely the reason, why all these people are contracting cancer. And yet the U.S. government doesn't take care of them, even though they'll definitely stand on these people's graves to say why we need to continue the Afghanistan war in their honor. All right, on to some news about Russia. Former U.S. Marine Dan Whelan, who, I forget when, it might be a year now, was attending the wedding of his twin brother in Russia when he was found with a USB drive with state secrets. I guess this isn't disputed, as his kind of lawyer and legal team's claim isn't that there weren't state secrets on the drive, but that he was set up, and he has been held in Russia ever since. Russia announced that he will remain there for at least another 3 months. Russia and Ukraine have come to an agreement on how much Russian companies will pay Ukraine to transport their fuel and gas through Ukraine via Ukrainian pipelines. And so this was a big deal, as, I already talked about earlier in the show. Russia's completing a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, in northern going into Central Europe, a Turk Stream pipeline. I think there's another one coming online pretty soon as well. The pipeline running through Ukraine is having less and less move through it, which means less money for the Ukrainian government. And of course, that state is so corrupt. A lot of, I'm sure, oligarchs and different wealthy connected people are having their pocketbooks hit. So Ukraine was really looking to turn up and take more, raise the percent of the tariffs to try to offset the amount because less is going through. They finally came to an agreement that was a slight increase in the percentage that Russians will pay to get gas through Ukraine. But it is just a good example of how much things cost in the world, because you have all these different, little corrupt fiefdoms around the world. In this case, it's Ukraine, where there's a whole bunch of gas giants there who, kind of siphon off and steal most of the wealth. And it's because of them that energy costs so much for the rest of us. Russia has officially opened a rail route connecting Russia's two largest cities, which I believe is St. Petersburg and Moscow, with the Crimean Peninsula, which has been Russian territory since 2014. This is, kind of further proof that Crimea will never once again, at least not anytime in the foreseeable future, be a part of Ukraine and will remain a part of the Russian Federation. Russia has put out indicators now that is willing to include its hypersonic missiles and some of its other new nuclear technologies in any kind of New START agreement with the U.S. So that's another positive sign, although it seems like Trump is committed to this position that says China must be included, which is an absolute poison pill because China says it doesn't make sense for them to enter the New START agreement with Russia and the U.S. as China's nuclear arsenal is several times smaller than the other two superpowers. The U.S. and South Korea carried out military drills in southern South Korea, simulating the securing of a facility of high-value targets in North Korea. This, isn't the kind of thing that needs to be happening right now, as North Korea has this looming end-of-the-year deadline. Tim Sherrock had a great piece on this, and I need to credit to myself a little bit because I guess I just went along with this narrative that Kim's end-of-the-year gift to the United States is going to be some kind of nuclear weapons test, whether that's a bomb, a missile, a new kind of engine, or potentially a satellite, which I think is a little bit different. I don't want to throw it in, lump in with the nuclear program, but something like that. And Tim Sherrod says actually it's just going to be North Korea saying that their new policy going forward is we're going to keep our nuclear weapons. We need our strategic nuclear deterrent, and we're just going to rely more inwards. It's not going to be trading our nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. We're just going to try to facilitate more economy within North Korea. And, maybe this also means trying to just grab a couple of trading partners who will be willing to bypass U.S. sanctions. Anyway, Tim Sherrod's piece is absolutely great. And he does talk about, he calls it the shadow war, but basically, what I've called the economic war, the maximum pressure strategy that the United States has had against Kim Jong-un this whole time, even while negotiations are going on. Tim Sherrod does a good job talking about things that I haven't talked as much about on the show, where I focus on the sanctions. He's going over all the new military equipment the United States has sent to Eastern Asia, and while some of that, they claim is to target or combat China, has serious implications for North Korea as well. This includes missiles that would have been in violation of the INF treaty. Moving on to India, where protests continue because of this new immigration law that's going to allow all non-Muslim immigrants living in India since at least 2015 to get Indian citizenship. And, it seems on the face of it to me, and this is what the Muslims are saying, that this is clearly a law that's trying to further sway the demographics of India. India also announced that they will do a census in 2020. I'm guessing that there's people in the country that are going to fear the census for various reasons, either realizing that their majority or minority group isn't as large or in as large of a majority as they thought. So, it could affect different kind of power balances and stuff like that in the country. Certainly because the Modi nationalist government, very strong Hindu, and seems to have issues with the Muslim minority in that country, maybe cheat on the census and portray it a different way. I wouldn't necessarily trust his government, to be honest, but also there's concerns that maybe this really isn't as much of a census as just compiling a database of people, knowing exactly how many people of different ethnic groups live where, making it much easier to target them for kind of ethnic cleansing or redistribution. There's a lot happening in Afghanistan right now. A U.S. soldier was killed. Jacob Hornberger has a great write-up at FFF on it, explaining that, this is another American soldier that's died for nothing, that he could come home in Afghanistan. It's going to be a mess when the Americans leave, but, that's going to happen now or 10, 20 years from now. So why have Americans 20 or more dying a year in Afghanistan, just to prolong the coming conflict between the different Afghan groups when we leave? We can't build a government there. This is proof of the September elections. So think all the way back to this, September 28th, you hold elections in this country. That's never really had a history of holding elections. There's not a strong consensus from the people that elections are the best way to pick a leader or anything like that. but you hold elections at the end of September. The preliminary vote count doesn't even come out till now. Since time, both one and number two, the current president, Ghazni, and then the current, I think they kind of compared CEO of Afghanistan, Abdullah. Both of those men have claimed victory. The preliminary vote count says, and this is in, vote totals that are way down from the past, the current president won a majority, 50 point something percent. However, this is only the preliminary result, and now there's thousands of complaints already, and they say that these complaints are likely to change the vote totals, so that there's at least required a runoff, as Ghazni won't have gotten 50% of the vote. This is just a mess, and nobody's going to believe in the legitimacy of this process because it's obviously on the face of it a huge joke. You have an election that you can't get preliminary results out for 3 months, and then it's going to be another 5 weeks, they say, to address all of these complaints. Likely that 5 weeks will turn into 2 months. And so 6 months down the line, you'll have maybe the announcement of election results. And who knows, that the announcement of election results could be another round of voting. What kind of legitimacy does that have in Afghanistan? I would guess very little to none. While there's this whole democratic charade going on, people continue to kill each other. Not only U.S. soldiers, but a Taliban attack on an Afghan base killed 15 people. Remember, we are now in winter in Afghanistan. There's usually a lull in fighting at this time, and I guess it hasn't been quite so many deaths as recently in Afghanistan, but nonetheless, fighting continues through the winter. In Iran, they reopened a part of their Arak nuclear reactor. The main part of this nuclear reactor was shut down as a part of the JCPOA. The part that they reopened has been retooled, so it doesn't really produce the kind of nuclear fuel that could be used for a bomb, but rather just heavy water isotopes used for, they said, agriculture, which I'm not sure what kind of agricultural product they use with this uranium, but medicines is the big one. Iran had a conference meeting with Malaysia, Turkey, and Qatar. All four countries agreed to trade more within their own currencies and look towards establishing some kind of gold-based bartering system to bypass U.S. sanctions. Bomb-sniffing dogs that the U.S. sends to Middle Eastern countries have had a legacy of being abused. This continues. 10 of the dogs sent to the Jordanians died of mistreatment, as well as 7 dogs I saw in one source and 10 in another that were sent to the Egyptians also recently died from maltreatment. Assad is making a push into Al-Qaeda's last major stronghold in Syria, the Idlib province. Basically what's happening there is he's trying to secure an important highway, the M5 highway, that links, I believe, Aleppo to the kind of northeastern Syria cities like Lakata, where the Russian naval base is, which is still held by the Al-Qaeda linked group. So this would be an important kind of trade route and transportation route if they could reopen this. The rebels are also firing on an oil refinery in Homs, so the more territory the Syrian government could take, the less these kind of civilian infrastructure is in the path of the Al-Qaeda fighters. No doubt there's a lot of Syrian civilians being killed here. Turkey is saying 120,000. Rights groups are putting that number closer to 50,000. Syrians have now fled the Idlib province into Turkey. Scores of civilians have been killed either in airstrikes or in Al-Qaeda attacks in response. But the Turkish forces, the Syrian forces are moving forward here. Twitter announced they permanently suspended hundreds of thousands of accounts that were pushing forward the narrative of the Saudi government, including on Yemen and Khashoggi. On the subject of Khashoggi, the Saudi judge had made a final ruling in the murder sentencing of those alleged to have killed him. This does not include the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, the son of the king, defense minister who started the war in Yemen, and widely to have been believed involved in the death of Jamal Khashoggi, as well as a top aide of his who was acquitted. 5 people were sentenced to death. 3 people were sentenced to 24-year prison sentences. However, the judge concluded the death wasn't premeditated and rather was a poor decision in the spur of the moment. It does not seem that justice had been served here, as likely again MBS and a top advisor were involved in this state-sanctioned killing of a journalist in a foreign consulate. That was the consulate in Turkey. On to Iraq. There's a really good episode of the Around the Empire podcast. Joanne Leon interviews Elijah Menier on kind of what's been happening in Iraq. He really goes through and explains it, especially what's going on with the protest movement a little bit better, and really helping to kind of understand what's happening with the protesters, who pro who, against who, rather than trying to break it all down on the show. I'm just going to send people over there for now. But one of the demands of the protesters, and Elijah explains this, was election reforms in Iraq. Previously, they had only been able to vote for party lists. So you have different parties in Iraq, and they have basically lists, and you just vote for which party you want, and then they put up the different leaders. And so I guess, Elijah kind of explains that you have however many different members of parliament you could basically exchange those for different cabinet positions, and that comes with different amounts of kind of corruption, money, and influence, and while the whole time the people suffer. So people can now vote for individual members of parliament. They think that would be a step in the right direction. Hopefully it goes that way for the Iraqis. We'll definitely see. A car bomb went off in, I believe, the Anbar province of Iraq, killing 2 Iraqi soldiers. In Yemen, in the city of Taiz, which is on the front lines of the war there was a prisoner swap. 135 people were freed. In a different town in Yemen, and I believe this is a town in the hands of the Yemeni government, the one backed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, a bunch of militants, and it wasn't really identified who, started attacking international aid groups after some media sources started publishing some false information about the international groups. RPGs hit several headquarters, and so they have evacuated from that town, and this is a country that desperately needs humanitarian aid. All right, I have more news on Turkey and their involvement in Libya. Just to kind of briefly summarize what I've been talking about on the show recently, is you have the UN recognized government of Libya, and that only controls a small portion, geography-wise, of northwestern Libya. I believe Tripoli, the capital, is the largest city, and then Marasta, the second largest city, are both controlled by the internationally recognized government there. And this government is backed by countries like officially the United States, militarily by Turkey, and Italy is a backer of this government. It's kind of described as a Muslim Brotherhood type of government. And then on the other side, you have the strawman, General or Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, backed by several Arab governments, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and then has support from Russia and France. Haftar's forces throughout 2019 have taken control of most of the country, and in recent months, the internationally recognized government of Libya signed an agreement with Turkey, which basically splits the international waters of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea in half between the two nations. An agreement pretty much rejected by anybody who knows international law, and particular complaints now from pretty much every country in the region, Egypt, Israel, and Greece, claiming that this is a violation of these waters. But Turkey sees it as a go-ahead for them to start drilling and energy exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. In exchange, the Libyan government would get military support that would prop them up. They've already been receiving armored vehicles. Some of those have been destroyed by airstrikes of Haftar's Air Force. One disturbing thing is Haftar's forces are saying now that Turkey is using civilian aircraft to bring in military aid, and that they could then fire on these aircraft. So hopefully this doesn't end up with a flight full of civilians being shot down, and some kind of conclusion needs to happen here. The problem is you have kind of like in Syria almost, where all these different international forces are going to be able to provide enough military support for the warring parties in the country to keep this civil war going on, I'm guessing, for quite some time if Turkey and these other governments continue to pour in resources. All right, and then the U.S. says they're creating a new position. This is going to be an envoy to the Sahel region of Africa. This is kind of the Sahara, bordering Sahara region of West Africa, where there's been a rise in Islamic extremism, and then those Islamic extremists finding themselves aligning with different sides of different civil wars or ethnic tensions in different countries. This has been worse in Mali, but is also a problem in Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, where dozens of people are killed in massacres. A lot of times, again, led by these extremist groups. You have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and then an ISIS affiliate that operates in the area, as well as Boko Haram. The envoy is tasked with, I guess, combining the efforts of the State Department, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community to take out these groups. However, as we've seen, the U.S. wars in these regions just spreads the reach of these groups further and doesn't actually do anything to combat them. So after we chase them out of Libya into Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso and Chad, where are we going to chase them from there? Into the Congo, into Nigeria, into all these other places, and create more terrorism. And of course, the legacy of the problems of all these civil wars in countries like Libya and Syria. So it's getting really bad in West Africa, and U.S. increasing drone war would only make it worse. So be on the lookout for that. Anyways, that's where I'll wrap it up for today. Share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Online, I'm on Twitter at KYAALE, and Facebook as a private group.